On the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, where the morning sun catches the water and turns it to hammered bronze, there stood a town whose name would become forever linked with one of history's most remarkable transformations. Magdala, called Migdal in Hebrew meaning tower, was no backwater village but rather a thriving centre of commerce and culture in first-century Palestine. Its prosperity came from the lake itself, from the fishing industry that employed hundreds and fed thousands, from the fish salting operations that preserved catches for export across the Roman Empire, and from the dye works that processed the lake's special purple mollusks into pigments coveted by the wealthy. The town's prosperity brought with it all the complications that wealth and commerce typically produce. Magdala sat at the crossroads of Jewish tradition and Greek influence, a place where Hellenistic culture mingled with Hebrew heritage in ways that scandalized the more conservative elements of Galilean society. Roman roads connected it to the wider empire. Greek language and customs infiltrated daily life. The town had developed a reputation, whether entirely fair or somewhat exaggerated, for moral looseness, for the kind of compromises that prosperity and cosmopolitanism often encourage. It was a place of opportunity and temptation, of wealth and corruption, of traditional values under pressure from modern realities. Into this world a woman had been born who would be known to history simply as Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. The text preserves almost nothing of her early life, her family circumstances, her social position before she encountered Jesus. Unlike other women in the gospel narratives who are identified by their relationships to men, Mary the mother of Jesus, Mary the mother of James and Joses, Mary the wife of Clopas, this Mary is identified solely by her hometown. The silence about family connections is itself significant. It may suggest that she was unmarried, or widowed, or perhaps estranged from family. It may indicate that she had means of her own, resources not derived from father or husband. Or it may simply reflect that her identity had become so completely bound up with her deliverance and her discipleship the previous connections faded into irrelevance compared to the new reality that Jesus brought into her life. What the text does preserve, with stark brevity, is the condition from which she was delivered. She had been possessed by 7 demons. The statement appears in Luke's Gospel as a matter of historical record, as straightforward as reporting someone's occupation or place of origin. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. No elaboration, no dramatic exorcism narrative, no detailed description of symptoms or circumstances, just the fact stated plainly, and the implication that her deliverance had been so complete and so transformative that it defined her subsequent identity. To understand what this meant requires entering the worldview of first-century Palestine, a world where the boundary between physical and spiritual causation was understood differently than in modern secular consciousness. Demon possession was a recognized category of affliction, distinct from ordinary illness yet manifesting in ways that often included physical symptoms, mental disturbance, emotional torment, and social isolation. The ancient world did not have modern diagnostic categories for mental illness, neurological disorders, or psychological trauma. What we might now classify as schizophrenia, severe depression, dissociative disorders, or post-traumatic stress would have been understood in spiritual terms, as the presence of malevolent entities that had taken up residence in a person and were tormenting them from within. The number 7 carries weight in Hebrew thought and should not be dismissed as mere detail. 7 represents completeness, fullness, totality. If one demon suggests affliction, 7 demons suggest complete domination, total bondage, comprehensive torment affecting every dimension of existence. This was not a minor problem or an occasional struggle. This was a woman who had been thoroughly, completely, utterly possessed by spiritual darkness. Whatever the specific manifestations, and the Gospels preserve examples of demon possession producing muteness, convulsions, superhuman strength, self-destructive behaviour, and social alienation, Mary's condition had been extreme. 7 demons meant she had been as bound as a person could be, as tormented as affliction could make someone, as isolated and desperate as complete spiritual oppression produces. Consider what this meant for her daily existence. In a culture that interpreted such conditions as divine judgment or punishment for sin, she would have carried not just the torment of the possession itself, but also the shame of assumed guilt. Her community would have avoided her, fearing both contamination and divine displeasure. If she had family, they would have been stigmatized by association, their social standing damaged by her condition. Any economic prospects would have been destroyed. No one contracts business with someone believed to be under divine curse. No one arranges marriages with families marked by such affliction. She would have been pushed to the margins, isolated from normal social interaction, cut off from the rhythms of community life that gave meaning and structure to existence in the ancient world. The psychological dimension of such isolation compounds the spiritual torment. To be avoided by others, to see fear and revulsion in the eyes of those who once knew you, to be whispered about and pointed at and used as a cautionary tale. This creates its own form of hell, even apart from whatever internal suffering the possession produced. And the hopelessness. If this condition was understood as divine judgment, then what appeal was possible? If the gods or God had marked you for affliction, what human remedy could possibly suffice? The rabbis might prescribe rituals or amulets. The priests might suggest sacrifices, but if 7 demons had taken up residence in your soul, what realistic hope existed for deliverance? Into this darkness, Jesus came. The text does not preserve the details of their encounter, does not describe the exorcism, does not record the words spoken or the specific circumstances. We are left to imagine the moment when a woman who had been completely bound by spiritual torment came face to face with the one person in all of Palestine who possessed both the authority and the compassion to set her free. Other exorcism narratives in the Gospels provide templates, the demons recognizing Jesus, crying out, perhaps violently manifesting before being expelled, the command spoken with authority, the sudden stillness after years of inner chaos, the silence after the voices, the peace after the torment. What we know with certainty is the result. The 7 demons went out. All of them. Completely. The deliverance was total, not partial. The freedom was absolute, not provisional. The woman who had been utterly possessed became utterly free. And this completeness of deliverance matters because it establishes something fundamental about Jesus' power and authority. This was not a temporary relief, or a managed symptom, or a reduction in severity. This was full restoration, comprehensive healing, complete liberation from everything that had bound her. The moment of deliverance must have felt like resurrection itself, as if she had been dead and was now alive, as if she had been in prison and was now free, as if she had been drowning and could suddenly breathe. Everything that had tormented her was gone. The voices that had plagued her were silent. The forces that had controlled her had fled. She was herself again, or perhaps truly herself for the first time, since we do not know how long the possession had lasted, or whether it had begun in childhood or adulthood. She stood in the presence of the man who had spoken a word and shattered her chains, who had commanded and darkness had obeyed, who had seen her not as cursed or contaminated, but as someone worthy of deliverance, someone worth saving, someone whose freedom mattered. What do you do when someone gives you back your life? How do you respond when you have been delivered from complete bondage into complete freedom? For Mary of Magdala, the answer was immediate and total. She would follow him. Not from a distance, not occasionally, not when convenient, but completely. She would leave behind whatever remained of her old life in Magdala, whatever family connections existed, whatever economic arrangements she had managed, whatever social position she might have rebuilt after deliverance. None of it mattered compared to staying near the one who had freed her, learning from the one who had saved her, serving the one who had given her back her humanity. This decision would have required courage of a sort that is difficult for modern readers to fully appreciate. First-century Palestine was not a culture that looked kindly on unmarried women travelling with religious teachers. The rabbinic tradition explicitly discouraged women from learning Torah. There were sayings to the effect that teaching Torah to women was like teaching them obscenity. For a woman to attach herself to an itinerant rabbi's group, to travel from town to town in the company of men who were not relatives, to learn and listen and participate in ways that conventional religious culture reserved for males, this was scandalous. It invited gossip, assumption, accusation. It marked her as loose, improper, shameless. But Mary had already been marked as worse than any of that. She had been demon-possessed, which in the eyes of many was evidence of profound moral failure or divine judgment for terrible sin. She had been an outcast, untouchable, avoided. What did she have to lose by following Jesus? What social standing could possibly be damaged more than it already had been? And more importantly, what did any of that matter compared to the freedom he had given her? Let them gossip, let them assume, let them judge. She knew what she had been and what she now was. She knew who had made the difference, and she would follow him wherever he went, whatever the cost, whatever the scandal. The text tells us that she was not alone in this decision. Luke's Gospel preserves a remarkable detail. Mary Magdalene was part of a group of women who had been healed of evil spirits and diseases, who travelled with Jesus and the 12, and who provided for them out of their own means. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager, Susanna, and many others. This was not a single woman making an isolated decision, but rather a movement of women who had experienced Jesus' transforming power and who devoted themselves to supporting his ministry. That these women provided for the group out of their own means suggests something important about their social and economic status. They were not destitute. They had resources, either inherited wealth or income from business ventures, or support from families that remained connected to them despite the scandal of their travels. Mary's ability to leave Magdala and support herself while travelling suggests she was not dependent on family for survival, that she had means of her own. Perhaps the fishing industry that made Magdala prosperous had provided her or her family with wealth. Perhaps she owned property or business interests that generated income. The text does not specify, but the implication is clear. She was among those who could afford to support not just themselves, but also Jesus and the apostles as they moved from town to town proclaiming the kingdom of God. This economic dimension of women's discipleship has sometimes been overlooked, but it was crucial. Someone had to pay for food when the group entered a new town. Someone had to provide for basic necessities when they stayed in regions where hospitality was not immediately forthcoming. Someone had to manage the practical logistics of an itinerant ministry that eventually involved not just the core group, but crowds of followers. The women who travelled with Jesus, who'd been healed and delivered and transformed by his ministry, chose to invest their resources in supporting the very movement that had saved them. And Mary Magdalene was prominent among them. Her devotion was fueled by gratitude, but it was more than gratitude. It was love. The kind of love that emerges when someone has been saved from the worst and brought into the best, when darkness has been replaced by light, when bondage has given way to freedom. She had been possessed by 7 demons, the fullness of spiritual torment, and he had freed her completely. Every day that she travelled with him, every evening when she listened to his teaching, every morning when she witnessed his compassion for the sick and the suffering, she was living the life that deliverance had made possible. She was experiencing freedom that had been unimaginable when she was bound. She was participating in a movement that was transforming lives the way her own life had been transformed. And there was something else, something that would have struck her with profound force every time she witnessed Jesus interact with women. He treated them as fully human, as worthy of teaching, as capable of understanding spiritual truth. He spoke to women in public, which scandalized the religious leaders. He allowed women to sit at his feet and learn, which violated conventional practice. He used women as examples in his parables, elevating their work and their faith as models worth emulating. He received their support and honored their service. In a world that often treated women as property or temptation or necessary evil, Jesus treated them as people, as souls worth saving, minds worth teaching, hearts worth engaging. For Mary, who had experienced the ultimate dehumanization of demon possession, who had been treated as cursed and contaminated, who had been isolated and avoided and feared, this restoration of dignity must have been almost as powerful as the deliverance itself. She was not just free from demons, she was free to be human, to learn, to grow, to serve, to participate in something larger than herself. The darkness that had consumed her had been replaced not just by absence of torment, but by presence of purpose. She had been given a new identity. No longer Mary the demon-possessed, but Mary the delivered, Mary the disciple, Mary the devoted follower of the one who had saved her. The woman who had once been bound by 7 demons had become one of the most faithful followers of the man who had freed her. The one who had been an outcast had become an insider in the kingdom of God. The life that had been consumed by darkness had become dedicated to following the light of the world. And this transformation, complete and radical and permanent, would sustain her through everything that was to come, through the mounting opposition to Jesus, through the growing danger of association with him, through the horror that would unfold on a hill outside Jerusalem, and ultimately through the morning when she would become the first witness to the greatest event in human history. But that morning was still ahead. For now, in the days of Jesus' ministry in Galilee and Judea, Mary of Magdala was simply one among many who followed him, who learned from him, who supported his mission, who had been transformed by his power and devoted herself to his cause. She was a woman who had been delivered from complete bondage and who had chosen to live in complete devotion to the one who had freed her. The darkness was behind her. The light was before her. And she would follow that light wherever it led, through joy and sorrow, through triumph and tragedy, through death itself and beyond into the morning of resurrection. The woman once bound in darkness had become a devoted follower of the light. Her story was just beginning, and the greatest chapters were yet to be written. The roads of Galilee and Judea in the early decades of the 1st century witnessed a phenomenon that would have seemed strange, even scandalous to most observers. A travelling rabbi accompanied not just by his male disciples, but also by a group of women who journeyed with them from town to town, who listened to his teaching in public spaces, who supported the entire enterprise with their own financial resources. This was not the way things were done. This violated the comfortable boundaries that kept religious life properly ordered and socially acceptable. Yet there they were, these women who had been healed and delivered and transformed, walking the dusty roads alongside the men, present at the teaching sessions, integral to the movement rather than peripheral to it. Luke's Gospel preserves the names of 3 of these women, and then adds a tantalizing phrase, and many others. Mary Magdalene is listed first, her prominence in the group apparently established not by social status or family connections, but by the depth of her devotion and the completeness of her deliverance. Joanna is named second, and her identification is striking. She was the wife of Chusa, the household manager or steward of Herod Antipas. This was not a minor position. Chusa oversaw the domestic affairs of the tetrarch who ruled Galilee and Perea, who had beheaded John the Baptist, who would later interrogate Jesus before the crucifixion. That his wife was travelling with Jesus' group, supporting the ministry financially, publicly associating herself with a movement that Herod viewed with suspicion. This required either remarkable courage or a husband who was himself sympathetic, or perhaps both. Susanna is named third, and we know nothing else about her beyond this single mention. The anonymity is itself instructive. She mattered enough to be named, to be remembered in the written record, yet her significance came not from who she was in conventional terms, but from what she did. She followed Jesus and supported his ministry. Then comes that phrase that opens the imagination. And many others who provided for them out of their own means. How many? Dozens? More? Luke does not specify, but the implication is clear. This was not a handful of women, but a substantial group, large enough to be notable, organised enough to manage the complex logistics of supporting an itinerant ministry. The economic dimension of this support deserves careful attention because it reveals something crucial about how Jesus' ministry functioned practically. An itinerant teacher and his disciples needed food, lodging, basic necessities. They needed resources for travel, for the purchase of supplies in towns where they had no connections, for the care of the sick they encountered and helped. The text occasionally mentioned specific individuals offering hospitality: Martha and Mary in Bethany, Zacchaeus in Jericho, Simon the leper in Bethany. But these isolated instances of hospitality could not have sustained a group that sometimes numbered in the dozens as they moved through the countryside. The women's financial support filled this gap. They provided for them out of their own means. The Greek phrase suggests regular, ongoing support from personal resources, not occasional charity but sustained patronage. In the Roman world, such patronage was a recognized social institution. Wealthy individuals supported philosophers, teachers, and religious movements they admired, providing the economic foundation that made teaching and learning possible. What was revolutionary here was not the patronage model itself, but who was doing the supporting. Women, in a culture where women's economic agency was limited, and where women's involvement in religious movements was supposed to be carefully circumscribed. That these women had means of their own to contribute requires explanation in a cultural context where women's economic independence was unusual. Some, like Joanna, may have had access to household wealth with their husband's permission or approval. Others may have been widows who inherited property or business interests. Still others, and Mary Magdalene may have been among them, may have owned businesses or had income from family estates. Magdala's fishing and dye industries created wealth, and women were not entirely excluded from commercial enterprises, especially in more Hellenized towns where Greek customs had somewhat loosened traditional Jewish restrictions on women's economic activity. But the economic support was only one dimension of these women's discipleship. They were also learners, students, disciples in the fullest sense of that word. The Greek term mathetes, usually translated disciple, means learner or student, someone who attaches themselves to a teacher in order to absorb not just information but a way of life, a perspective, a transformed understanding of reality. The 12 were called disciples, and they were men, chosen specifically by Jesus to form an inner circle that would eventually become the foundation of apostolic leadership. But the term was not exclusively applied to them. Others who followed Jesus, who learned from him, who committed themselves to his teachings, could also be considered disciples in a broader sense. The women who travelled with Jesus functioned as disciples in this broader sense. They heard the parables and asked questions. They witnessed the miracles and pondered their meaning. They observed how Jesus treated people, the sick, the sinful, the outcast, the powerful, and learned from his example. They absorbed his teaching about the kingdom of God, about the nature of true righteousness, about the character of the Father, about the radical demands and even more radical grace that defined the new reality he was proclaiming. They were being formed, transformed, their understanding reshaped by proximity to the master teacher. This was scandalous in ways that modern readers, especially those in cultures where women's education is taken for granted, may struggle to fully appreciate. The rabbinic tradition of first-century Judaism did not encourage women's study of Torah. There were famous sayings that expressed this clearly. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, whose life overlapped with Jesus' ministry, reportedly said, "If a man teaches his daughter Torah, it is as though he taught her obscenity." This was not a fringe position, but mainstream rabbinical opinion. Women were expected to learn the practical commandments necessary for running a household according to the law, but deep study of scripture, theological discussion, legal reasoning, these were male domains. Jesus ignored these boundaries completely. He taught in public spaces where women could hear. He engaged women in theological conversation. The Samaritan woman at the well received some of his most profound teaching about worship and identity. He allowed Mary of Bethany to sit at his feet in the posture of a disciple, while her sister Martha worked in the kitchen, and when Martha complained, Jesus defended Mary's choice. He used women as positive examples in his parables. The persistent widow, the woman who found her lost coin, the poor widow whose small offering he praised above the large donations of the wealthy. He treated women's faith as exemplary. The Syrophoenician woman whose quick response to his test impressed him. The woman with the hemorrhage whose touch demonstrated faith. The woman who anointed him with expensive perfume whose devotion he honoured. For Mary Magdalene and the other women disciples, this treatment must have been continually astonishing. Every time Jesus included them in teaching sessions, every time he responded seriously to their questions, every time he honoured their faith or service or understanding, he was implicitly declaring that they were fully human in ways that much of their culture denied. They had minds capable of understanding spiritual truth. They had souls worth teaching. They had roles to play in the kingdom of God that transcended conventional limitations. They were not second-class citizens in the realm Jesus was establishing, not mere supporters of the real work being done by men, but participants, learners, disciples in their own right. The bond among these women must have been remarkable. They shared the experience of having been healed or delivered by Jesus. They shared the decision to follow him despite social cost and cultural disapproval. They shared the daily rhythms of travel and teaching, of witnessing miracles and hearing parables, of watching Jesus confront religious leaders and comfort the suffering. They supported each other in a venture that required courage, that invited criticism, that marked them as different from the conventional women who stayed home and lived ordinary lives defined by household management and social expectation. Mary Magdalene's place in this community of women disciples seems to have been prominent. Luke lists her first among the women he names, suggesting a leadership role, or at least a recognised primacy. This prominence likely derived from multiple factors: the dramatic nature of her deliverance from 7 demons, the depth of her devotion and gratitude, the completeness with which she had committed herself to following Jesus, perhaps also her financial contributions if she indeed had substantial means from Magdalene's prosperity. She was someone the others looked to, someone whose faith and commitment set a standard, someone whose presence helped define what it meant to be a woman disciple in this movement that was challenging so many conventional boundaries. But prominence in this community was not about status or power in conventional terms. It was about service, about devotion, about the depth of one's transformation and the completeness of one's commitment. Jesus had taught explicitly that greatness in the kingdom of God was measured by service, that whoever wanted to be first must be servant of all, that the last would be first and the first last. The 12 struggled with this teaching. The sons of Zebedee asked for the best positions in the kingdom, prompting Jesus to explain again that leadership meant service, that he himself had come not to be served but to serve. The women disciples seem to have grasped this more readily, perhaps because they had never expected status or power, perhaps because their very presence in the group was already an act of service rather than ambition. As the ministry progressed and the crowds grew larger, as the opposition from religious authorities became more intense, as the danger of association with Jesus became more apparent, these women remained. They did not seek positions of prominence. They did not jockey for special treatment. They simply continued to follow, to support, to learn, to serve. When Jesus spoke difficult teachings that caused some followers to turn away, the women stayed. When he set his face toward Jerusalem despite warnings that danger awaited him there, they continued to travel with the group. When the political tensions escalated and association with Jesus became potentially dangerous, they did not distance themselves for safety's sake. This persistence, this steady devotion through mounting challenges, reveals something crucial about the nature of their discipleship. They were not following Jesus because they expected earthly rewards or political benefits. The movement was not trending toward power and success in conventional terms. Anyone with eyes could see that the religious establishment viewed Jesus as a threat, that the political authorities were wary of him, that confrontation was increasingly likely rather than increasingly avoidable. The women continued to follow, not because of what they might gain, but because of what they had already received. Healing, deliverance, transformation, a new identity, a new purpose, a new understanding of God and themselves and the world. For Mary Magdalene specifically, the devotion ran even deeper. She had been delivered from complete bondage, from 7 demons, from a condition that had isolated her and tormented her and destroyed any hope of a normal life. Jesus had spoken a word and she was free. Completely, totally, permanently free. How could she do anything other than devote her life to following him? What else could possibly matter compared to staying near the one who had saved her? Where else would she go? What other life could compare to the one she now lived, travelling with the teacher who had given her back her humanity? The uniqueness of her situation, possessed by 7 demons, the fullness of spiritual torment, gave her devotion a particular intensity. Others had been healed of diseases, delivered from demons, forgiven of sins. But 7 demons suggested a bondage that few others had experienced and survived. Her deliverance was proportionately dramatic, proportionately complete, proportionately transformative. She had come from further in the darkness than most. She had been brought further into the light, and the gratitude that fueled her devotion was proportionately deep. As the months turned into years, Jesus' public ministry lasted somewhere between 1 and 3 years, depending on how the gospel accounts are harmonized. These women disciples witnessed the full arc of his teaching and healing ministry. They were there when he fed thousands with a few loaves and fish. They were there when he calmed storms and walked on water. They were there when he healed lepers and gave sight to the blind and raised the dead. They heard him debate the Pharisees and challenge the Sadducees, and silence the scribes with wisdom they could not refute. They watched crowds gather and disperse, watched opposition mount and intensify, watched Jesus navigate the complex political and religious landscape with a combination of courage and wisdom that sometimes seemed reckless, yet always proved precisely calibrated. They also witnessed his more private moments, the times when he withdrew to pray, the conversations with his inner circle, the teaching that went beyond what he shared with the crowds. They saw his compassion for the suffering, his anger at injustice and hypocrisy, his love for his disciples, his unwavering focus on the mission he had come to accomplish. They saw him tired and energized, sorrowful and joyful, tested and triumphant. They came to know him not as a distant figure but as a teacher and friend, as someone who had fundamentally altered the trajectory of their lives and who continued to shape them day by day through his presence and his teaching. The text preserves few specific stories about these women during the ministry years. They appear primarily in summary statements, Luke's mention of their support, occasional references to the crowds that included both men and women, fleeting glimpses of women present at various events. This textual silence does not mean they were unimportant, but rather reflects the gospel writer's focus on Jesus himself and on the 12 who would become apostolic leaders. But the silence ends dramatically at the crucifixion, when the women's faithfulness becomes not a background detail, but a central element of the narrative. While male disciples fled, while Peter denied, while the 12 scattered in fear, the women remained. And at that moment their persistent, quiet, faithful discipleship would be revealed as something precious, something that would position them to witness events that the fleeing male disciples would miss. But that darkness was still ahead. For now, in the days of Jesus' active ministry, Mary Magdalene and her companions were simply disciples among disciples, women who had been transformed and who had devoted themselves to following the one who had transformed them. They were learning and serving, watching and wondering, journeying and supporting, participating in a movement that was challenging every comfortable boundary and conventional expectation. The outcast had become an insider in the kingdom of God. The one who had been possessed was now a devoted follower. The woman who had been avoided and feared was now integral to a community that was changing the world. And through it all, Mary carried within her the memory of what she had been and the gratitude for what she had become. 7 demons had bound her. One word from Jesus had freed her, and she would follow him anywhere, through any challenge, into any danger, sustained by love and gratitude so deep that nothing could diminish it, nothing could extinguish it, nothing could turn her away from the one who had saved her from the darkness and brought her into the light. The final week began with triumph and ended with horror. Jesus entered Jerusalem riding a donkey, crowds lining the roads and waving palm branches, voices raised in praise and expectation. The women who had followed him from Galilee were there, witnesses to what seemed like vindication, like the moment when their teacher would finally receive the recognition he deserved, when the kingdom he had proclaimed would manifest in power. But anyone who had been listening carefully to Jesus over the preceding months knew that something darker lay ahead. He had spoken repeatedly about going to Jerusalem to suffer and die, about being rejected by the religious authorities, about being handed over to the Romans, The disciples had struggled to understand these predictions, had sometimes rebuked him for such dark talk, had clung to hopes that the kingdom would manifest in political triumph rather than through suffering. The women travelling with the group had heard these same predictions, and must have felt the same confusion, the same unwillingness to accept that the story might end in tragedy rather than victory. The week unfolded with increasing tension. Jesus taught daily in the temple courts, his words sharp and challenging, his confrontations with religious leaders growing more intense. The authorities plotted against him. Judas made his betrayal arrangement. Thursday evening brought the Passover meal, and then the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the arrest. Events cascaded with terrible speed after that. The nighttime trial before the Sanhedrin, the morning presentation to Pilate, the shuttle to Herod Antipas, and back to Pilate, the choice of Barabbas over Jesus, the scourging, the crown of thorns, the way of suffering through Jerusalem's streets to the place of execution. Most of the male disciples vanished during these hours. When Jesus was arrested in the garden, they all fled. Peter followed at a distance and managed to get into the courtyard of the high priest's house, but when questioned about his association with Jesus, he denied knowing him, 3 times just as Jesus had predicted. By the time Jesus was condemned and led out to be crucified, the 12 had scattered into the city, gone to ground, hidden themselves away for fear that association with a condemned criminal would bring them under suspicion and danger. This was not cowardice in any simple sense, but rather the normal human response to genuine threat. Rome did not take political crimes lightly. Anyone closely associated with someone executed for sedition, and crucifixion was specifically the punishment for political rebellion, could reasonably fear being rounded up as a co-conspirator, but the women did not flee. The Gospel accounts are explicit and consistent on this point. Women who had followed Jesus from Galilee were present at the crucifixion, watching from a distance. Matthew names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Mark lists Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joses, and Salome. Luke refers more generally to women who had followed Jesus from Galilee standing at a distance. John's account places women even closer to the cross itself. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Harmonizing these accounts presents challenges that have occupied scholars for centuries, but one fact emerges clearly from all 4 Gospels. Mary Magdalene was there. While male disciples hid, she remained. While Peter denied, she witnessed. While the 12 scattered, she stood her ground. The question of why the women remained when the men fled admits several answers, none entirely satisfactory alone, but together forming a plausible explanation. First, women may have been perceived as less threatening by the authorities. Rome and the temple establishment were concerned about male political actors, about leaders and potential rebels. Women, in that patriarchal culture, were not seen as politically dangerous, and thus may have been able to move more freely without arousing suspicion. Second, the cultural role of women in caring for the dying and preparing bodies for burial meant their presence near an execution might have seemed natural, expected, part of their gender-assigned duties rather than evidence of political allegiance. Third, and perhaps most important, the women had less to lose in terms of future prospects. The male disciples had professional lives to return to, reputations to protect, families dependent on them. The women had already sacrificed social standing by following Jesus, had already marked themselves as different, and may have calculated that they had less to risk by remaining visible. But beyond these practical considerations lay something deeper. They loved him, and love does not calculate risk with the same mathematics that fear employs. Mary Magdalene had been delivered from 7 demons. This man had given her back her life, her sanity, her humanity. Whatever danger attended staying near him, whatever suspicion she might draw by remaining visible as his follower, how could she abandon him now? The very thought would have been impossible. She would stand with him to the end, would bear witness to whatever came, would not let him suffer and die without the comfort of knowing that someone who loved him remained present and faithful. The horror of what she witnessed cannot be overstated, though attempts to describe it risk either sensationalism or inadequate sanitization. Roman crucifixion was designed to be not just lethal but maximally cruel, a public spectacle of torture that served as warning to anyone contemplating rebellion against imperial authority. The process began with scourging, flogging with a whip embedded with metal or bone fragments that tore flesh from back and sides, often exposing muscle and bone, sometimes causing death before crucifixion itself began. Jesus endured this, and then carried or dragged the heavy crossbeam through the streets, while crowds watched and soldiers supervised. The humiliation was part of the punishment. Stripped naked or nearly so, bloodied and weakened, stumbling under the weight, becoming an object of mockery and revulsion. At Golgotha, the place of the skull, a site outside Jerusalem's walls where executions were conducted, the actual crucifixion took place. Victims were laid on the cross, their wrists or hands nailed to the crossbeam with thick iron spikes driven through flesh and between bones. The feet were nailed to the vertical post, often with a single spike through both feet, or with each foot nailed separately. Then the cross was raised and dropped into a socket in the ground, the jarring impact sending shockwaves of pain through the body. And then the waiting began, sometimes for days, as the body slowly succumbed to a combination of factors: blood loss, trauma, shock, exposure, and eventually suffocation, as the victim's ability to push up on nailed feet to draw breath gradually failed. The Gospel accounts do not dwell on these physical details, but preserve instead particular moments and statements. Jesus was crucified between two criminals. The soldiers divided his garments and cast lots for his clothing. A sign was placed above his head: Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. In 3 languages, Pilate's sardonic political statement that this was what happened to Jewish would-be kings. The crowd and religious leaders mocked him. He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah. One of the criminals crucified beside him hurled insults, while the other defended Jesus and asked to be remembered in his kingdom. Jesus spoke from the cross, words preserved with careful attention: forgiveness for his executioners, a promise to the repentant criminal, provision for his mother's care, expressions of thirst and abandonment, and finally the declaration that all was accomplished. Mary Magdalene witnessed this. She stood at a distance or near the cross itself. The Gospel accounts vary on proximity, and watched the man who had delivered her from demons being tortured to death. She heard the mockery, saw the soldiers gambling for his clothes, witnessed his suffering extend through hours as the sun rose to midday, and then, strangely, darkness covered the land from noon until 3 in the afternoon. She heard his cries, including that terrible moment when he called out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in words from Psalm 22 that expressed the full depth of his anguish, and perhaps also served as a kind of rabbinic citation, pointing those who knew Scripture to a psalm that begins in abandonment but ends in triumph and vindication. What thoughts passed through her mind during those hours? What did she feel as she watched the one who had freed her from bondage now bound to a cross? The one who had healed so many now himself wounded beyond recognition. The teacher whose voice had spoken truth and life now gasping for breath and crying out in pain. Did she remember the day he had cast out the 7 demons that tormented her? Did she recall his teaching, his compassion, the countless moments when she'd seen him restore others as he had restored her? Did she wonder why God would allow this? Why the Father would not intervene to save the Son? Why all the power that had been displayed in healings and miracles seemed now absent or withheld? The text preserves no words from Mary at the cross, no speeches or laments. She is simply there, present, bearing witness. Perhaps there were no words adequate to the moment. Perhaps grief and horror had silent speech. Or perhaps her presence itself was the statement, the testimony of faithfulness that required no verbal articulation. She had followed Jesus because he had saved her. Now she would remain with him through his dying, because that is what love does. It stays, even when staying brings no benefit, even when the one you love is being destroyed before your eyes, even when hope seems to die with every laboured breath. John's Gospel preserves a detail that the others omit. Jesus, seeing his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, entrusted his mother to this disciple's care. "Woman, here is your son," he said to Mary his mother and to the disciple. "Here is your mother." This act of provision in the midst of his own agony reveals something about Jesus' character. Even dying, he thought of others, ensured his mother would be cared for, handled the practical necessities that his death would create. And Mary Magdalene witnessed this, saw him caring for his mother, saw the disciple John accepting the responsibility, saw love manifesting even in the extremity of suffering. Then, at 3 PM, after 6 hours on the cross, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "It is finished," or according to Luke, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he died. The moment of death would have been visible to those watching. The sudden stillness, the head slumping forward, the end of the laboured breathing that had characterised the preceding hours. The one who had been fighting for every breath now breathed no more. The body that had been tense with pain now hung limp from the nails. Jesus was dead. The Gospel accounts record that at the moment of Jesus' death, extraordinary things happened. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split, and tombs broke open. A Roman centurion witnessing all this declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God, or surely this was a righteous man." But for Mary Magdalene and the women standing vigil, these cosmic signs may have barely registered. The man they loved was dead. The teacher who had transformed their lives had been executed like a common criminal. The hope they had invested in him seemed to have died with him on that cross. What followed next required quick action because of the approaching Sabbath. Jewish law prohibited leaving bodies hanging on crosses during the Sabbath, which would begin at sunset. Already it was late afternoon, and procedures for burial needed to be completed before nightfall. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had been a secret disciple of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for permission to take the body. Pilate, somewhat surprised that Jesus had died so quickly, crucifixion victims sometimes lingered for days, sent to confirm the death, and then granted permission. Joseph, assisted by Nicodemus, another Sanhedrin member who had previously come to Jesus by night, took Jesus' body down from the cross. They had brought materials for a proper burial, linen cloths, and a large quantity of spices, myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds according to John's Gospel. This was an enormous amount, fit for royalty, suggesting both the wealth of these two men and their desire to honour Jesus despite the shame of his execution. They wrapped the body with the spices in strips of linen, according to Jewish burial customs, and laid it in a new tomb that Joseph owned, located in a garden near the place of crucifixion. And the women watched. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid, noted the location of the tomb, observed how Joseph and Nicodemus handled the body, and completed the burial preparations. This detail matters enormously because it establishes that the women knew exactly where Jesus had been buried, that there would be no confusion 2 days later about which tomb they should visit, that their testimony about the empty tomb could not be dismissed as going to the wrong location. They watched the stone being rolled in front of the entrance to seal the tomb. They saw the place. They would remember. But the burial was necessarily hasty. The Sabbath was approaching, and once sunset came, no work could be done. Joseph and Nicodemus had done what they could in the limited time available, taken down the body, wrapped it with spices, placed it in the tomb. But the women, experienced in burial customs, may have felt that more could be done, that additional spices and proper anointing would honour Jesus more fully than what the rushed burial had allowed. So they made mental note of the tomb's location and went away to prepare additional spices and perfumes. But they had to wait. The Sabbath was upon them, and they observed the Sabbath rest according to the commandment. That Sabbath must have been the longest day of Mary Magdalene's life since the day Jesus had delivered her from the 7 demons. Everything had changed in a matter of hours. The teacher she had followed for years was dead. The movement that had given her life meaning seemed finished. The future that had seemed so full of possibility now appeared closed off. Impossible. She'd come to Jerusalem for Passover expecting some kind of culmination, some manifestation of the kingdom Jesus had proclaimed. Instead, she had witnessed his execution, had seen him die the death of a criminal, had watched his body being taken down from the cross and laid in a tomb. What did she do during that long Sabbath? The text does not say. Perhaps she huddled with the other women, sharing grief, trying to make sense of what had happened, wondering what would become of them now that their teacher was gone. Perhaps she prayed, though what prayers could possibly suffice in such darkness? Perhaps she wept, the tears of grief mixed with the tears of confusion and loss and shattered hope. Perhaps she remembered the day of her deliverance, remembered the journey of discipleship, remembered his teaching and his kindness and his power that now seemed so utterly defeated by the forces of religious and political authority. But even in the darkness of that Saturday, even in the depth of her grief and confusion, something in Mary Magdalene remained faithful. She did not leave Jerusalem. She did not return to Galilee, did not go back to Magdala, did not try to resume whatever life she might have had before Jesus had freed her from the demons. Instead, she prepared spices and perfumes. She would return to the tomb. She would anoint his body properly. She would perform this last act of love and devotion, would honour him in death as she had followed him in life. It was all she could do, all that remained possible. But she would do it. She would not let him lie in that tomb without the full honour that devotion demanded, even if he was dead, even if hope was gone, even if the story seemed to have ended in tragedy and defeat. Sunday was coming. The first day of the week was approaching, and Mary Magdalene, grief-stricken and faithful, would rise in the darkness before dawn and make her way to the tomb, carrying spices to anoint a dead body, expecting nothing but the opportunity to complete the burial rites that the hasty Sabbath Eve burial had left unfinished. She had no idea that she was about to become the first witness to the greatest event in human history. She knew only that she loved him, that he had saved her, and that she would honour him in death as she had followed him in life. The cross had been devotion in the darkest hour. The empty tomb would be revelation in the morning light. But first came the Sabbath, the waiting, the grief that seemed like the end of everything. Mary Magdalene sat in that darkness, faithful still, preparing to return to the tomb as soon as the Sabbath ended, and the first light of Sunday morning made travel possible. She did not know what awaited her there. She could not have imagined it. But she would go, because love goes even into the darkness, even to the tomb, even when all hope seems lost and nothing remains but the act of devotion itself. The first day of the week came with darkness still covering Jerusalem. The Sabbath had ended at sunset Saturday, but the women waited through the night. Travelling in darkness was dangerous, and the work they intended to do required light. So they rose in the pre-dawn hours, while stars still marked the sky, and the eastern horizon showed only the first hint of approaching sunrise. Mary Magdalene gathered the spices and perfumes she had prepared, sweet-smelling aromatics that would be mixed with oils to anoint Jesus' body in the final act of honour and love that remained possible. The other women, the Gospel accounts vary on exactly who accompanied her, mentioning Mary, the mother of James, Salome, Joanna, and others, made their own preparations. Then they set out through the still sleeping city toward the garden where Joseph's tomb stood. As they walked through the quiet streets, one practical problem weighed on their minds. Mark's Gospel preserves the question they asked each other: who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? This was not a trivial concern. Tomb entrances were typically sealed with large circular stones that rolled in a groove cut into the rock. These stones were heavy, requiring several strong men to move them, and designed to be difficult to open, both to prevent wild animals from entering and to deter grave robbers. The women knew they could not move such a stone themselves, yet they went anyway, carrying their spices, determined to complete their task somehow, even if they had not fully worked out the logistics. This detail reveals something about the nature of devotion. It does not wait for every obstacle to be resolved before acting, does not require every question to be answered before moving forward. The women would go to the tomb, and they would trust that somehow the problem of the stone would find a solution. The garden was quiet when they arrived, the early morning air still cool, the light beginning to grow as dawn approached, and then they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. The stone had been rolled away from the entrance. The massive barrier that they had worried about removing was already gone, moved aside, leaving the tomb open. John's Gospel specifies that Mary Magdalene came to the tomb while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been removed. The detail about darkness is significant. She could not see clearly into the tomb itself yet, but she could see that the entrance was open, that something was wrong, that the sealed tomb she expected to find was instead accessible. Her first reaction was not joy, but alarm. This was not how tombs were supposed to be. Sealed tombs remained sealed. The stone being moved meant something had gone wrong, meant someone had tampered with the burial site, meant the worst fear of the ancient world regarding the dead had been realised. The body was vulnerable, perhaps taken, perhaps desecrated. Grave robbery was a known problem in the ancient world, serious enough that Rome passed laws imposing severe penalties on those who violated tombs. But the fear was not primarily about the loss of burial goods, though those might be valuable, but rather about the violation of the body itself, the dishonouring of the dead that such interference represented. Mary's mind went immediately to this conclusion. She did not think resurrection. She thought theft. Someone had taken the body. The careful burial that Joseph and Nicodemus had performed, the sealed tomb that protected Jesus' remains, the dignity and death that they had tried to preserve, all of it had been violated. The body was gone. And if it was gone, then even this final act of devotion she had come to perform, the anointing with spices, the final honouring of the dead, was now impossible. Everything had been taken from her. First his life at the crucifixion, now even his body from the tomb. She ran. John's Gospel is explicit about this. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. The distance from the garden to wherever the disciples were hiding was not short, but grief and alarm gave her speed. She found Peter and John, the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, is John's characteristic way of referring to himself without using his own name, and gasped out her terrible news. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Notice the plural, we don't know. Mary Magdalene was not alone in discovering the empty tomb, though John's narrative focuses on her specifically. The other women who had accompanied her presumably also saw the moved stone, also felt the alarm, also wondered what had happened. Mary's statement is crucial for understanding the state of mind of those first witnesses to the empty tomb. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb. She assumed human agency, assumed interference, assumed theft or removal. The hypothesis of resurrection did not occur to her, despite Jesus having predicted his death and resurrection multiple times during his ministry. This is psychologically realistic. People in grief do not leap to supernatural explanations, do not expect the impossible even when the impossible has been explicitly predicted. Mary knew Jesus was dead. She had watched him die. She had seen his body taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb. Dead people stay dead. Tombs remain sealed. Bodies remain where they are placed. Those are the operating assumptions of human experience. An open tomb meant violation, not vindication. Peter and John responded immediately. They ran to the tomb, John outrunning Peter, a detail that might reflect the younger man's speed, or perhaps John's particular urgency. Mary followed them back, though presumably at a slower pace, her initial sprint having exhausted her, or perhaps her grief slowing her steps. When the two men reached the tomb, they found exactly what Mary had reported. The stone rolled away, the entrance open. John arrived first, but hesitated at the entrance, bending down to look in but not entering. Peter, true to his impulsive character, went straight in. And what they saw inside was strange, puzzling, not what one would expect if the body had been stolen by grave robbers or removed by enemies. The burial cloths were still there, lying where the body had been. The cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head was folded separately, placed by itself. This arrangement of the burial cloths became important evidence in the disciples' eventual belief in resurrection. Grave robbers would not have taken the time to unwrap the body. They would have taken body and cloths together, or simply taken the body wrapped as it was. And they certainly would not have carefully folded the headcloth and left it separate from the other linens. The scene inside the tomb suggested not theft but something else, something for which they did not yet have a category or explanation. John records that when he finally entered the tomb and saw the arrangement of the cloths, he saw and believed. What exactly he believed at that moment is subject to interpretation. The next verse adds, "They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead." So John believed something. Perhaps that Mary's hypothesis of grave robbery was wrong, that something more significant had occurred, but full understanding of resurrection had not yet crystallized. It would take more than an empty tomb and discarded burial cloths to overcome the deep human certainty that the dead do not return to life. Peter and John left the tomb and returned to where they were staying, their minds full of questions and incomplete understanding. But Mary Magdalene remained at the tomb. This detail matters enormously. The men went away, back to the safety and familiarity of wherever they were lodging, back to the other disciples to report what they had seen and to try to make sense of it. But Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb weeping, unable to leave, held there by grief and devotion, even though the body she had come to anoint was gone, even though there seemed nothing left to do, even though staying at an open tomb served no practical purpose. Why did she remain? The text does not explain her reasoning, but the psychology is transparent. She could not bear to leave. This tomb was the last connection to Jesus, the place where he had been laid, the site that held whatever remained of her relationship with the teacher who had delivered her from demons and given her a new life. The body might be gone, but this was still the place, still sacred ground, still the location where devotion had brought her in the darkness before dawn. To leave would be to sever the last thread, to admit that nothing remained, to accept that even this final act of love had been made impossible by whoever had taken the body. So she stayed, weeping, unable to go and unable to do anything by staying, held in place by grief that exceeded practical considerations. As she wept, she bent down to look into the tomb. Perhaps she wanted to see for herself what Peter and John had seen, wanted to verify that the body was truly gone, wanted one more look at the place where he had been laid. And what she saw startled her. 2 angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. The detail is specific, visual, the kind of thing an eyewitness would remember. Their position corresponding to where the body had lain, their white garments contrasting with the darkness of the tomb, their presence both comforting and otherworldly. They asked her a question that seems almost absurd in its simplicity. "Woman, why are you crying?" Why was she crying? Her teacher was dead, executed like a criminal. His body had been taken from the tomb. Everything she had hoped for had collapsed. Everything she had followed him for seemed to have ended in tragedy and violation. Why was she crying? The question could seem cruel, except that it functioned as an invitation, a drawing out, an opportunity for her to articulate the grief that consumed her. Her answer was immediate and focused. "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him." Notice the possessive, my Lord, not the teacher or Jesus, but my Lord, the personal claim, the intimate identification. And notice what concerned her. Not theories about who had taken the body or why, not theological speculation about what it all meant, but simply the practical loss. I don't know where they have put him. She wanted to know where the body was so she could go there, so she could complete the anointing she had come to perform, so she could do what love demanded even though he was dead. At this point, still weeping, she turned around and saw someone standing there, but she did not recognize him. John's Gospel simply states this fact without explanation. She saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. The non-recognition is crucial for understanding what happened next. This was not a case of seeing someone from a distance and being unsure of their identity. She was close enough to have a conversation. She looked at him directly, yet she did not know him. Why? Perhaps her tears blurred her vision. Perhaps she was looking down more than looking at him, her grief making sustained eye contact difficult. Perhaps the early morning light was still dim enough to make facial features unclear. Or perhaps, and this is suggested by other post-resurrection appearances, where Jesus was not immediately recognised, there was something different about his resurrection body, something that made him not instantly identifiable even to those who had known him well. The figure asked her the same question the angels had asked. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" The question added a new dimension. Not just why the grief, but what was she seeking? What was she hoping to find? And Mary, still not recognising him, still assuming she was speaking to someone who might have information about the missing body, made a practical request based on a reasonable assumption. Looking at this figure in the garden near the tomb, she thought, the gardener. This made sense. Someone would maintain the garden where Joseph's tomb was located. Someone would have reason to be there early in the morning. Someone might have moved the body if it was deemed to be in the wrong place, or if there was some issue with the burial. So she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." This statement reveals so much about her devotion. She did not ask for help in retrieving the body. She did not demand explanation for why it had been moved. She simply asked to know the location, and she would go get him herself. Never mind that a woman alone could not carry a dead body any significant distance. Never mind that she had no legal authority to move remains or claim the body. Never mind any of the practical obstacles. Just tell me where he is, and I will get him. Love does not calculate impossibilities. Devotion does not measure practicalities. She would get him somehow, would do whatever was necessary, would not let him lie in some unknown location without the honour and care that love demanded. And then came the moment that changed everything. The single word that transformed grief into joy, confusion into clarity, death into life. He spoke her name, Mary. Not a title or a general address, but her personal name, spoken in the way he had always spoken it, with the familiar inflection and tone that she had heard countless times during the years she'd followed him. In that instant, in the hearing of her own name spoken in his voice, everything shifted. Recognition flooded through her. The gardener was not a gardener. The stranger was not a stranger. The dead was not dead. This was Jesus. Her immediate response, Rabboni, burst from her lips in Aramaic, the language of intimacy and home, the word that meant my teacher, but carried more personal weight than the common rabbi. It was the cry of recognition, of joy, of impossible hope suddenly become reality. She reached for him, moved to embrace him, or cling to him, or touch him to verify that he was real, and not some grief-induced vision. The one she'd watched die was standing before her alive. The body she'd come to anoint with burial spices had no need of burial because he was not dead. He was here. He was real. He was speaking her name. In that moment, the first day of the week became what Christians would call the Lord's Day, the day of resurrection, the morning when death was defeated and hope was reborn. And the first person to whom the risen Christ revealed himself, the first witness to the resurrection, the first to hear her name spoken by the one who had conquered death, was Mary Magdalene, the woman who had once been possessed by 7 demons, who had been delivered and had become a devoted disciple, who had remained faithful through the crucifixion when others fled, who had come to the tomb in the darkness before dawn to anoint a dead body, who had stood weeping when the body was gone, who had stayed when others left, whose devotion had brought her to exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment to witness the most important event in human history. The confusion and despair of the empty tomb had prepared the ground for revelation. The grief that had kept her at the garden when others went away had positioned her to be the first to see, the first to hear, the first to know. The woman who had come expecting death found life instead. The mourner who sought a corpse to anoint encountered a living Lord who spoke her name. And in that encounter, everything changed, not just for her, but for the whole world. Though she did not yet fully understand the magnitude of what she had witnessed, the greatest revelation of history had been entrusted to a grieving woman. The first testimony to resurrection would come from lips that had been weeping moments before. The initial witness to conquered death would be someone who much of her culture would dismiss as unreliable, whose word would not be accepted in legal proceedings, whose testimony would be doubted precisely because of her gender. Yet God chose her. Jesus revealed himself first to her. The morning of a resurrection began with her name spoken in his voice, with her recognition transforming grief into joy, with her encounter preparing her for the mission that would come next. But first came this moment, pure recognition, overwhelming joy, the impossible becoming actual, the dead becoming living, the grief becoming gladness. "Rabboni," she said, and in that word was everything. Devotion and recognition, love and wonder, the acknowledgement that her teacher, her Lord, the one who had saved her from darkness and given her light, was alive, was here, was real, was risen from the dead just as he had said he would be. Though she had not understood, though she had not believed, though she had come expecting only to honour his corpse, and had found instead the living Christ, the moment of recognition was everything. One word, her name, had shattered the darkness and transformed grief into wonder. Mary Magdalene stood in that garden as the morning light grew stronger, face to face with the impossible made actual, with death defeated, with the teacher she had watched die now standing before her alive. "Rabboni," she had cried out, the Aramaic word erupting from her lips with all the force of joy too great for measured speech, of relief too profound for formal address, of love too deep for anything but the intimate term that acknowledged him as her teacher in the most personal sense. She must have moved toward him instinctively, must have reached to embrace him or touch him, or verify through physical contact that this was real and not some cruel vision born of grief. The Gospels do not describe her physical gesture in detail, but Jesus' immediate response makes clear that she attempted some form of contact, some tangible connection to the one she had thought lost forever. And his words to her, while initially puzzling, reveal something crucial about the nature of his resurrection and the new relationship that would exist between him and his followers. "Do not hold on to me," Jesus said, or in the older translation that has echoed through centuries of Christian reflection, "do not cling to me." The Greek phrase, mimuhaptu, is brief but dense with meaning. The verb suggests grasping, clinging, holding tight. The kind of desperate grip that fears letting go will mean loss. Jesus was not rejecting her affection, or forbidding all touch. Later that same day, he would invite Thomas to touch his wounds, would allow the disciples to handle him and verify his physical reality. The issue here was not touch itself, but a particular kind of holding on, a clinging that tried to freeze the moment, to keep things as they had been, to prevent the necessary movement forward into what must come next. "For I have not yet ascended to the Father," Jesus continued. The resurrection was not the end of the story, but a beginning, not a return to the old life, but a transition to something new. He would not remain on earth indefinitely in the way he had been present before his death. He would ascend to the Father, would return to the glory he had with the Father before the world began, would take his rightful place at the right hand of divine majesty. Mary could not cling to the Jesus of the past 3 years, could not hold on to the earthly ministry as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Death had been defeated, yes, but that defeat opened a new phase of divine purpose, a new form of relationship between Jesus and his followers, a new reality that required letting go of the old even while embracing the new. But then came the commission, the transformation of Mary from witness to messenger, from one who had received revelation to one who must proclaim it. "Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." This statement deserves careful attention because it contains layers of theological significance, wrapped in what seems like a simple message. Jesus called the disciples my brothers, not servants, not followers, but brothers, family, bound to him by something more intimate than the teacher-student relationship, by something that the resurrection had sealed and the ascension would complete. The crucifixion and resurrection had accomplished what Jesus had predicted. Through his death and rising, those who believed in him would become children of God, would enter into the family relationship that he enjoyed with the Father, would become brothers and sisters to the Son. And notice the careful phrasing, my Father and your Father, my God and your God. Not our Father, as if the relationship were identical, but a distinction that honoured both the unique sonship of Jesus and the adopted sonship of believers. Jesus' relationship to the Father was eternal, essential, unbroken even by death. The disciples' relationship to the Father was derivative, granted through Jesus' work, made possible by his death and resurrection. Yet the distinction did not diminish the reality of the gift. The same Father who was Jesus' Father had become their Father. The same God who was Jesus' God had become their God. The resurrection had opened the way for humanity to enter into the divine family, to know God as Father in a way that the Old Covenant had barely hinted at, and that the prophets had longed for. Mary was entrusted with this message, this astounding declaration that would change everything for the disciples hiding in fear somewhere in Jerusalem. She had been first to see the risen Lord. Now she would be first to proclaim his resurrection. The commission was explicit. Go and tell. Do not remain in the garden basking in the joy of this encounter. Do not cling to this moment as if it could be preserved in amber. Go, tell, carry the message that death is defeated, that Jesus is risen, that the Father awaits those who will come through the Son, that everything Jesus had taught and promised is vindicated by his empty tomb and his living presence. This role, first witness, first messenger, first proclaimer of resurrection, would earn Mary Magdalene a title that the early church bestowed with intentional weight. Apostola Apostolorum, apostle to the apostles. The term apostle means one who is sent, a messenger commissioned with authority to speak on behalf of the one who sends them. The 12 were apostles in a unique sense, chosen by Jesus to be the foundation of the church, granted authority to teach and lead and govern the community that would grow from their testimony. But Mary was given an apostolic function in this moment, sent by the risen Christ himself to bear witness to the resurrection, commissioned to carry the most important message in human history to those who would become the official witnesses and teachers. The paradox of this commission would not have been lost on anyone in first-century Palestine, though its full irony would only become apparent when Mary actually delivered the message. Women were not considered reliable witnesses in Jewish legal tradition. The Mishnah, compiled in the 2nd century but reflecting earlier practice, explicitly states that women could not serve as witnesses in court proceedings. Their testimony was deemed inadmissible, unreliable, insufficient to establish truth in matters that required legal proof. This was not unique to Judaism. Roman law and Greek customs similarly devalued women's testimony, reflecting a widespread ancient conviction that women were too emotional, too easily deceived, too unreliable to be trusted as witnesses in important matters. Yet here was the risen Christ, choosing as the first witness to the resurrection, the event upon which all Christian faith would rest, the truth claim that would be contested and debated and martyred for across centuries, a woman, not one of the 12, not Peter despite his leadership role, not John despite his closeness to Jesus. But Mary Magdalene, the woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out, the devoted disciple who had remained at the cross and come to the tomb, the one whose testimony would be dismissed as unreliable by the very culture in which she lived. If Jesus had wanted to ensure that the resurrection message would be taken seriously by the maximum number of people, he would have appeared first to men, to the recognized leaders, to those whose word carried weight in both Jewish and Roman culture. Instead, he appeared first to Mary, spoke first to her, commissioned first her, as if to emphasize that God's economy operates by different principles than human hierarchies, that divine wisdom chooses what the world despises, that the last shall be first and the unlikely shall be honoured. Mary left the garden carrying this message, her grief transformed into joy, her confusion replaced by clarity, her despair turned to hope. She had come in the darkness before dawn to anoint a corpse. She was leaving in the growing light of morning, having encountered the living Christ. She had expected to find death, and had found life instead. She had prepared spices for burial, and had received a commission for proclamation. The woman who had been possessed by 7 demons, who had been delivered and transformed and made a disciple, who had remained faithful through crucifixion and death, had now become the first witness to resurrection and the first messenger of the good news that death was defeated. The journey from the garden to wherever the disciples were gathered must have seemed simultaneously too long and too short. Too long because she carried news that could not wait, that demanded immediate sharing, that made every step feel like delay when what she wanted to do was shout the message to the world. Too short because she needed time to process what had happened, to make sense of the impossible encounter, to prepare words adequate to the magnitude of what she had witnessed. How do you tell people that the dead man they saw crucified is alive? How do you explain that you have seen him, spoken to him, heard him call your name? How do you convince anyone that what seems impossible is actually, incredibly, wonderfully true? When she found the disciples, the text does not specify the location, but they were likely still in or near the upper room where they had gathered after the crucifixion. Hiding for fear of the Jewish authorities, she delivered her message. John's Gospel preserves it in simple, direct terms. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. Notice the personal testimony. "I have seen the Lord," not "I think I saw" or "I believe I encountered," but the direct, unqualified claim of eyewitness experience. She had seen him, she was sure, and she reported not just the fact of his appearance, but also his specific message about ascending to the Father, about the new relationship between God and the disciples, about the family bond that resurrection had sealed. The response of the disciples to Mary's testimony is recorded in Luke's Gospel with painful clarity, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. The Greek word used, leros, is even stronger than nonsense suggests. It means delirious talk, idle chatter, the kind of thing said by someone whose mind is not working properly, perhaps someone overcome by grief or hysteria. The disciples heard Mary's testimony and dismissed it. This was not because they were particularly skeptical or hard-hearted, but because what she claimed was impossible according to everything human experience teaches. Dead people stay dead. Executed criminals do not rise from their tombs. Crucified bodies do not return to life. Mary might be sincere, might even believe what she was saying, but she must be mistaken, must have seen someone else, must have experienced some grief-induced vision or hallucination, and the fact that the witness was a woman made her testimony easier to dismiss. This is the harsh reality that must be acknowledged. If Peter or John had come with this message, the other disciples might have struggled to believe but would have taken the report more seriously. Mary's gender made her testimony vulnerable to dismissal in ways that male testimony would not have been. The cultural prejudice that devalued women's witness, that considered their word insufficient for legal proceedings, that assumed they were more prone to emotion and deception than men, all of this made it possible for the disciples to hear her stunning announcement and conclude that she was simply mistaken or deluded. This dismissal of Mary's testimony creates one of the great ironies of the resurrection narrative. The disciples, who should have been prepared to believe because Jesus had explicitly predicted his death and resurrection multiple times, did not believe when the message came from a woman. They had to see for themselves, had to encounter Jesus directly, had to have their own experience of the risen Christ before faith became possible. Thomas, who was not present when Jesus appeared to the other disciples later that day, famously declared that he would not believe unless he could touch the wounds, unless he could verify physically that the risen Christ was the same Jesus who had been crucified. The disciples demanded evidence that they were unwilling to accept when it came through Mary's testimony. Yet this disbelief, this initial dismissal of Mary's witness, serves an important function in the larger narrative. It establishes that the resurrection was not easily believed, not readily accepted, not something that the disciples wanted to believe so badly that they convinced themselves of it despite contrary evidence. They were skeptics, doubters, people who required convincing. The fact that they eventually did believe, did testify, did stake their lives on the truth of resurrection, many of them dying as martyrs rather than recanting, carries more weight precisely because they did not believe easily or quickly. They believed because they saw, because the evidence became overwhelming, because Jesus appeared to them repeatedly over 40 days in various contexts and circumstances, until doubt became impossible. But Mary believed before they did. Mary testified before they would. Mary proclaimed resurrection while they still dismissed it as nonsense. She was the first, the initial witness, the one entrusted with the message before any of the men had seen or believed. This firstness matters because it establishes that the resurrection was not a message crafted by the male disciples to serve their purposes, not a story invented by those who had political or religious reasons to perpetuate Jesus' movement. If the disciples had fabricated the resurrection, they never would have made women the first witnesses. Doing so undermined the credibility of their testimony in the very culture where they needed to be believed. The fact that the Gospels preserve the embarrassing detail that women were first, that Mary Magdalene saw before the apostles believed, that the initial proclamation came from someone whose testimony would be dismissed. This argues strongly for historical truth rather than theological invention. The Gospels also preserve another detail that reinforces this point. When Paul lists the resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, then to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all to me. He does not mention the women at all. This omission has troubled interpreters, but it makes sense if Paul was building a legal argument, assembling testimony that would be credible in a court of law or in public discourse. Women's testimony would not have served that rhetorical purpose in the ancient world. Paul was not denying that the women saw Jesus first, but he was constructing an argument using witnesses whose testimony would be culturally accepted. The Gospels, by contrast, were not primarily legal briefs, but theological narratives, and they preserved the full truth regardless of whether it helped or hindered credibility in conventional terms. Women saw first, women testified first, and the greatest truth in history was announced initially by one least likely to be believed in human eyes. Mary Magdalene stood in the room with the disciples, having delivered her message, having proclaimed what she had seen and heard, having fulfilled the commission Jesus had given her in the garden. They did not believe her. They thought she was deluded or mistaken or speaking nonsense. Yet she had done what she was called to do. She had seen the Lord. She had heard his voice. She had received his message. And she had proclaimed it faithfully, regardless of whether her audience accepted it or not. The truth of the resurrection did not depend on their belief. The reality of Jesus rising was not contingent on their acknowledgement. She had witnessed it. She had testified to it. And whether they believed in that moment or not, she had become forever the first witness of the resurrection, the first to proclaim that Jesus was alive, the first to announce that death had been defeated and hope had been reborn. Later that same day, Jesus would appear to the disciples themselves. They would see him, touch him, believe him. Thomas would eventually put his finger in the nail marks and his hand in the side wound and confess, "My Lord and my God." The resurrection would become the foundation of apostolic preaching, the central claim of Christian faith, the truth for which countless believers would suffer and die. But all of that came later. First came Mary in the garden, hearing her name, recognizing her teacher, receiving the commission to go and tell. First came her testimony, dismissed as nonsense yet faithfully delivered. First came the woman whom culture deemed unreliable, becoming the messenger of the most reliable truth in human history. The gardener's voice had called her by name. The risen Lord had commissioned her as his messenger, and Mary Magdalene, delivered from 7 demons, devoted disciple, faithful witness, had become the first to proclaim the resurrection, the apostle to the apostles, the one whose voice would echo through centuries declaring the message that changes everything. I have seen the Lord. The commission Jesus gave to Mary Magdalene in the garden was not a suggestion or an invitation, but a direct mandate. Go and tell. 2 simple verbs, yet they contained within them a transformation of identity and purpose that would reverberate through Christian history. Mary had come to the tomb as a mourner, carrying spices to anoint a corpse, expecting nothing beyond the final act of devotion that burial customs required. She left as a herald, carrying a message that would transform human history, commissioned directly by the risen Christ to proclaim what she had witnessed. The shift from mourner to messenger, from witness to proclaimer, from one who sought the dead to one who announced the living. This was not merely personal transformation, but vocational calling, a divine appointment to a task that would define her legacy forever. The message she carried was revolutionary in its implications. I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. These words, spoken by the risen Jesus and delivered by Mary to the disciples, announced a new reality that the crucifixion had purchased and the resurrection had secured. The barrier between God and humanity had been breached. The chasm that sin had created and that the law had made explicit had been bridged. Through Jesus' death and rising, those who believed in him were brought into the family of God, adopted as sons and daughters, given the right to call the Creator of the universe Father in the same intimate way that Jesus did. This was not merely forgiveness of sins, though it included that. This was not merely access to God's presence, though it granted that. This was family membership, participation in the divine life, a relationship that transcended legal categories and entered into the realm of belonging. The theological sophistication of this message should not be missed. Jesus distinguished between his relationship to the Father and the disciples' relationship, my Father and your Father, maintaining the unique status of his eternal sonship while simultaneously declaring the reality of their adopted sonship. He was the Son by nature, eternally begotten, of one substance with the Father. They were sons and daughters by grace, adopted through his work, brought into the family through the cross and the empty tomb. Yet the distinction did not diminish the gift. The same Father who loved the Son from eternity now extended that love to embrace all who would come through the Son. The same God who was Jesus' God, not in the sense that Jesus was less than divine, but in the sense that the incarnate Son had lived in submission to the Father's will, was now their God, their protector, their provider, their covenant Lord who had bound himself to them in unbreakable relationship. Mary proclaimed this message to disciples who did not believe her. Luke's account is painfully explicit. They did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. The Greek term leros suggests not just skepticism, but dismissal, the kind of response given to someone whose mental state is questionable, whose grip on reality seems tenuous. The disciples heard Mary's testimony, "I have seen the Lord," and concluded that grief had unhinged her, that sorrow had produced delusion, that what she claimed to have experienced was impossible, and therefore could not have happened regardless of how sincere she might be. This dismissal reflected multiple factors converging in a single moment of rejection. First, there was the sheer impossibility of what she claimed. Resurrection was not part of normal human experience. Dead bodies stayed dead. Crucified criminals did not walk out of their tombs. The disciples had Jewish categories for resurrection. They believed it would occur at the end of time, when God would raise all the dead for final judgment. But resurrection in the middle of history on the third day after death, affecting one individual while everyone else remained in their graves, this was unprecedented, unthinkable, beyond the bounds of what theology or experience had prepared them to accept. Second, there was the testimony's source. Mary was a woman, and women's testimony carried little weight in first-century Jewish culture. The legal tradition codified what common practice assumed. Women could not serve as witnesses in court. Their word was insufficient to establish truth in matters requiring verification. Their emotional nature made them unreliable reporters of fact. This was not unique to Judaism. Roman law and Greek philosophy shared similar assumptions about women's incapacity for objective testimony. A woman claiming to have seen the risen Jesus was claiming something already impossible, and the gender of the claimant made dismissal easier, gave the disciples permission to reject the testimony without seriously engaging with what it might mean if it were true. Third, there was the disciples' own psychological state. They were hiding for fear of the Jewish authorities, traumatized by the events of the past few days, struggling to process the catastrophic failure of everything they had hoped for. Jesus had predicted his resurrection, yes, but they had not understood, or believed those predictions even when he was alive and explaining them directly. Now, in the aftermath of crucifixion, with their teacher dead and their movement apparently finished, they were not in a mental state to accept good news that seemed too wonderful to be true. Grief and fear had closed them off from hope, made them unable to receive the message that should have been exactly what they most wanted to hear. Yet Mary had delivered her message faithfully. She had not tailored it to make it more believable, or softened it to make it easier to accept. She had not hedged her testimony with qualifications or presented it as uncertain. She had proclaimed what she had seen and heard. Jesus was alive, she had spoken with him, he was ascending to the Father, and the disciples were being brought into relationship with God as Father. She had fulfilled her commission regardless of reception, had been faithful to the task regardless of results. This faithfulness in the face of disbelief would characterize Christian witness across the centuries. The message proclaimed, whether accepted or rejected. The truth testified, whether believed or dismissed. The gospel announced, whether received with joy or met with scorn. The disciples' disbelief would not last long. Later that same day, the first day of the week, the day Christians would come to call the Lord's Day, Jesus appeared to them directly. He entered the room where they were gathered despite the locked doors, showed them his hands and side, spoke peace to them, commissioned them to continue his work, breathed on them the Holy Spirit. Thomas, who was absent from this first appearance, refused to believe the other's testimony until he could see and touch for himself, declaring, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, Jesus appeared again specifically for Thomas's benefit, invited him to touch the wounds, and received his confession, "My Lord and my God." These appearances to the disciples validated what Mary had proclaimed. They confirmed her testimony. They proved that she had not been deluded or mistaken, that her witness was reliable, that the message she carried was true. But the validation came after her proclamation, not before. She had testified before they believed, had announced resurrection before they had seen, had fulfilled her apostolic commission before the apostles themselves had encountered the risen Christ. Her faithfulness did not depend on their reception. Her obedience did not wait for their confirmation. She had seen the Lord, and she told them so, and that was what Jesus had commanded her to do. The term apostle to the apostles, apostola apostolorum in Latin, emerged in Christian tradition to honour this role. The designation appears in the various forms in patristic and medieval sources, most famously in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome, and later in the works of Thomas Aquinas and others. The title acknowledged what the Gospel accounts make explicit. Mary Magdalene was sent by the risen Christ to bring the resurrection message to the 12, functioning as an apostle in the literal sense of one who is sent as a messenger, with a specific commission. She was not an apostle in the sense of having the governmental and teaching authority that Jesus gave to the 12, not part of the foundation of the church in the way that Peter and John and the others were. But she was apostolic in this crucial moment, entrusted with the initial proclamation of resurrection, serving as the bridge between Jesus' empty tomb and the disciples' eventual belief. The irony of God choosing Mary as first witness and first messenger was not lost on early Christian writers, who saw in this choice a divine reversal of human hierarchies and expectations. Why would Jesus appear first to a woman when appearing first to the male disciples? Would have made the message more credible, more easily accepted, more likely to spread quickly. Why entrust the most important announcement in human history to someone whose testimony would be dismissed by the very culture where it needed to be proclaimed? The answer that emerged in Christian reflection was that God delights in choosing the unlikely, in honouring what the world despises, in demonstrating that divine wisdom operates by principles that subvert human calculations. This pattern appears throughout Scripture. God chose Abraham when he was old and childless to become the father of nations. God chose Moses, who stuttered and feared public speaking, to confront Pharaoh and lead Israel. God chose David, the youngest son, overlooked by his own family, to become Israel's greatest king. God chose Mary of Nazareth, a peasant girl in an occupied territory, to bear the Messiah. God chose fishermen and tax collectors rather than scholars and priests to be the foundation of the church. And God chose Mary Magdalene, woman and former demoniac, to be the first witness of resurrection and the initial herald of the risen Christ. The pattern is consistent. God's choice confounds human expectation. His honour falls on the unlikely. His purposes are accomplished through those the world dismisses. This divine choice also reversed something broken at humanity's beginning. In Genesis, the serpent deceived the woman, and through her the knowledge of good and evil came to the man, and sin entered the world. Now, in the garden near the tomb, a woman encountered not a deceiver, but the truth incarnate, received not a message of death, but a proclamation of life, and carried to the men not temptation, but gospel. Some early Christian writers saw in this symmetry a deliberate reversal. As a woman had been involved in the entrance of death, so a woman would be involved in the announcement of death's defeat. As Eve had been deceived in a garden, Mary would be enlightened in a garden. As the first woman had carried news that led to condemnation, this woman would carry news that led to salvation. The theological weight of Mary's commission extended beyond her personal role to establish a principle that would shape Christian understanding of witness and mission. The Church would come to see that all believers, regardless of gender, social status, education, or any other human qualification, were called to proclaim what they had seen and heard of Christ. If Mary Magdalene, woman and former demoniac, could be commissioned as a witness to resurrection, then no one was too unlikely, too disqualified, too marginal to serve as a messenger of the gospel. The message was too important to be restricted to those whom human society deemed credible. The truth was too powerful to be limited to those whom culture honoured as reliable. God would use whom he would use, would send whom he would send, would empower whom he would empower, regardless of whether they fit human expectations or met conventional qualifications. Mary's faithfulness in delivering her message despite its rejection also modelled something essential about Christian witness. The messenger's responsibility is to proclaim the message, not to ensure its acceptance. She could not make the disciples believe. She could not overcome their skepticism by force of argument or weight of personality. She could only testify to what she had experienced, announce what she had been commissioned to announce, and trust that God would work through her witness in his own time and way. The message she carried was not hers to adjust or modify, or soften to make it more palatable. She was not the author of the gospel, but its herald, not the creator of the message, but its deliverer, not the one who made it effective, but the one who spoke it faithfully. This distinction between faithful proclamation and effective conversion would become crucial for the Church's understanding of evangelism and witness. Christians were called to testify, to announce, to proclaim what they knew of Christ, but they could not force belief, could not manipulate acceptance, could not guarantee that their message would be received. The power to transform hearts, to open eyes, to create faith belonged to God alone. The witness simply spoke, simply testified, simply told what they had seen and heard, and left the results to divine sovereignty and human freedom. Mary Magdalene embodied this principle in that first proclamation of resurrection. She told them they did not believe, yet she had been faithful, had completed her mission, had obeyed her commission. Later, Jesus would appear to them and they would believe. But that was Jesus' work, not hers. Her task was to go and tell. Their belief would come through their own encounter with the risen Christ, not through her persuasive powers or compelling rhetoric. She was a messenger, and a messenger's job is to deliver the message accurately and faithfully, nothing more and nothing less. The message itself, I have seen the Lord, became a template for Christian testimony across centuries. The resurrection was not primarily a doctrine to be argued or a theory to be defended, but an encounter to be testified about. Mary did not say, "I believe Jesus rose from the dead," as if she were accepting a theological proposition. She said, "I have seen the Lord," as someone reporting an experience, declaring what her eyes had witnessed and her ears had heard and her heart had recognized. This personal testimony, this first-hand witness, this "I have seen," became the foundation of apostolic preaching and remains the core of Christian witness. Not arguments from a distance, but testimony from encounter. Not theories about God, but experience of God. not propositions to affirm, but a person to proclaim. The other women who had accompanied Mary to the tomb also served as witnesses, though the Gospel accounts vary in their specific details about who was present and what they experienced. Matthew mentions Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark lists Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke refers generally to Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them. John focuses primarily on Mary Magdalene, but acknowledges she was not alone. "We don't know where they have put him," she said to Peter, using the plural. These variations in detail, which have troubled some readers and delighted skeptics, actually support the authenticity of the accounts, by showing that the Gospel writers were working with multiple eyewitness testimonies that overlapped, but did not perfectly align, which is exactly what happens when different people witness the same events from different perspectives and remember different details. What all the accounts agree on is Mary Magdalene's presence and prominence. She is named first in every list of women at the tomb. She is the one whose encounter with the risen Jesus is described in detail. She is the one explicitly commissioned to carry the message to the disciples. The other women were witnesses too, faithful too, commissioned too, but Mary's role was primary, her testimony central, her commission explicit. She stood out among the women as the women stood out among the disciples by their presence at the cross and their persistence at the tomb. As the first day of the week progressed, as Jesus appeared to various disciples and groups, as the impossible reality of resurrection gradually penetrated the fog of disbelief and grief, Mary's initial testimony was vindicated. They did see the Lord. They did encounter the risen Christ. They did come to believe what she had proclaimed to them in the morning while they dismissed her words as nonsense. And in their eventual belief, in their transformation from doubters to proclaimers, in their willingness to stake their lives on the truth of resurrection, Mary's faithfulness found its fruit. She had planted the seed with her testimony. Jesus had watered it with his appearances, and belief had grown from proclamation that was initially rejected but ultimately confirmed. The commission to go and tell did not end with that first day or with that first message to the disciples. It extended forward, became the calling of every believer, shaped the church's self-understanding as a community sent into the world to proclaim what they had seen and heard of Christ. Mary Magdalene became the model of that proclamation, the first in a long line of witnesses who would say, "I have seen the Lord," and whose testimony would be met sometimes with belief, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with persecution, but who would remain faithful to the commission regardless of reception. Go and tell, announce what you have witnessed, proclaim what you know, testify to what you have experienced, be faithful to the message even when the message is rejected. This was Mary's calling, and through her it became the calling of the church. The messenger of the resurrection had stepped into her divine calling, and from that garden on that first day of the week, the message began its journey across centuries and continents, proclaimed by countless voices in countless languages, transforming countless lives through the testimony that began with a woman's encounter with her risen Lord and her faithful obedience to go and tell what she had seen. The Gospel narratives close with Mary Magdalene's encounter at the tomb and her proclamation to the disciples, leaving much of her subsequent story shrouded in the silence that covers most of the early church's history, beyond what Acts and the epistles record. We do not know how long she lived after the resurrection, where she travelled, what specific role she played in the growing Christian movement. The text does not tell us whether she was present in the upper room when the Holy Spirit fell at Pentecost, though Luke notes that women were among those gathered in prayer. We do not know if she remained in Jerusalem or returned to Galilee, or travelled elsewhere as the gospel spread across the Roman world. Tradition fills some of these gaps with various claims, that she travelled to Ephesus with Mary, the mother of Jesus and John, or that she went to Rome and confronted the emperor, or that she ended her days in southern France. But these traditions, while ancient and honoured in various Christian communities, cannot be verified with the same historical confidence as the Gospel accounts themselves. What can be traced with certainty is not the remainder of her earthly life, but rather the trajectory of her remembrance in Christian tradition and the theological weight of her story across the centuries. Mary Magdalene became, in both Eastern and Western Christianity, a figure of profound significance, honoured as the first witness of resurrection, celebrated as a model of devotion and faithfulness, and unfortunately also subject to centuries of misidentification and confusion that obscured her true identity and diminished her actual role. The most consequential confusion began with a homily preached by Pope Gregory I in the year 591. Gregory, preaching on the Gospel texts, conflated Mary Magdalene with two other figures mentioned in Luke's Gospel, the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet with tears and perfume in Luke chapter 7, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Gregory's reasoning seemed logical to him. Luke introduces Mary Magdalene immediately after the story of the sinful woman, and the anointing stories in the Gospels have similarities that might suggest they refer to the same event. From this conflation, Gregory concluded that Mary Magdalene was a reformed prostitute, that the 7 demons represented 7 deadly sins, and that her devotion to Jesus stemmed from having been forgiven much because she had sinned much. This identification, preached by a pope whose authority carried enormous weight in Western Christianity, became standard interpretation for nearly 14 centuries. Medieval art depicted Mary Magdalene as a penitent prostitute. Sermons used her as the archetypal example of sexual sin, forgiven and transformed by grace. The term Magdalene became synonymous with reformed prostitute in several European languages. Houses for women leaving prostitution were called Magdalene asylums or laundries. Her feast day became associated with repentance from sexual sin. And her actual identity, delivered from demon possession, devoted disciple, first witness of resurrection, was buried under layers of false identification that had more to do with medieval attitudes toward women and sexuality than with anything the biblical text actually said. The Eastern Orthodox Church never made this conflation. In Eastern tradition, Mary Magdalene remained distinct from both the sinful woman and Mary of Bethany, honoured specifically for her role as equal to the apostles and the first to proclaim resurrection. Icons depicted her holding a red egg, symbolising the resurrection, and associated with a legend that she presented an egg to the Emperor Tiberius and declared Christ is risen, at which point the egg turned red to confirm her testimony. Her feast day on July 22nd was celebrated without the penitent prostitute associations that dominated Western observance. But in the West, the confusion persisted until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s officially distinguished Mary Magdalene from the sinful woman and Mary of Bethany, acknowledging that Pope Gregory's conflation had been mistaken. The revision of the Roman Missal removed references that conflated the figures. And in 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day to the level of a feast of an apostle, formally recognising her role as apostle to the apostles and her unique place in salvation history as the first witness of resurrection. This long history of misidentification matters because it demonstrates how easily historical truth can be obscured by theological interpretation, how vulnerable women's stories are to being reshaped to serve agendas that have little to do with their actual lives, and how important it is to distinguish between what the text actually says and what later tradition has added. The biblical Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. She was a woman delivered from demon possession who became a devoted disciple and the first witness of resurrection. The prostitute label, however well-intentioned in its emphasis on grace and forgiveness, actually diminished her story by replacing her real identity with a false one, and her actual role with a reduced caricature. The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945 added another layer of complexity to Mary Magdalene's legacy. Documents like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the Pistis Sophia portray her as having special insight into Jesus' teachings, as being particularly beloved by Jesus, and sometimes as being in conflict with Peter over authority and understanding. These texts, dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries and representing Gnostic Christianity rather than Orthodox tradition, have been used by some modern interpreters to argue that Mary Magdalene held a more prominent leadership role in the early church than later patriarchal structures wanted to acknowledge, that she was systematically marginalised and her teaching suppressed. The Orthodox response to these claims notes that the Gnostic texts are later than the canonical Gospels, represent a different theological framework that the early church rejected as heretical and should not be given equal weight with apostolic testimony. The canonical Gospels do honour Mary Magdalene's role as first witness, do preserve her prominence among the women disciples, and do not suppress her testimony. They record it explicitly, preserve it carefully, and explain that the apostles initially did not believe her precisely because she was a woman. The fact that the Church preserved this embarrassing detail rather than editing it out argues against systematic suppression. What the canonical texts do not do is give Mary Magdalene governmental authority over the Church, or teaching authority equivalent to the 12, and the Gnostic texts' claims that she possessed secret teachings or special authority cannot be verified and reflect Gnostic theology more than historical reality. What emerges from sorting through centuries of tradition, confusion, and contested claims is the figure that the canonical Gospels present. Mary Magdalene was a woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out, whose deliverance led to devoted discipleship, who supported Jesus' ministry financially along with other women, who remained faithful at the cross when male disciples fled, who came to the tomb on the first day of the week expecting to anoint a corpse, who encountered the risen Christ and was commissioned to proclaim his resurrection, and who faithfully delivered that message to the apostles despite their initial disbelief. This is her story, and it is remarkable enough without the additions, distortions, or speculative reconstructions that have accumulated around it. The theological weight of her story centres on 3 interconnected themes that continue to resonate across Christian tradition. First, there is the theme of radical transformation. Mary went from being possessed by 7 demons, the fullness of spiritual bondage, to being the first witness of resurrection, the apostle to the apostles, the initial herald of the gospel. Her transformation was not gradual improvement or moral development, but rather dramatic deliverance, followed by complete devotion. She embodies the truth that no one is too bound, too broken, too lost for Christ's redeeming power. The 7 demons that possessed her did not disqualify her from becoming a devoted disciple. Her past did not prevent her from being entrusted with the most important message in human history. Grace chose her, transformed her, used her, honoured her, not despite her history, but precisely in order to demonstrate that grace reaches those whom society dismisses, and that God's purposes are accomplished through those whom human hierarchies overlook. Second, there is the theme of devotion proved through faithfulness. Mary's love for Jesus was not a feeling that evaporated when circumstances became difficult, but rather a commitment that persisted through crucifixion and death. She did not flee when the cross made discipleship dangerous. She did not abandon Jesus when he was executed like a criminal. She came to the tomb in the darkness before dawn to anoint his body, to honour him in death as she had followed him in life. This persistence, this refusal to turn away even when hope seemed lost, positioned her to be present for the greatest revelation in human history. Devotion that remains faithful in darkness is rewarded with light. Love that persists through death encounters resurrection. Third, there is the theme of unlikely witness. The greatest truth in Christian faith, that Jesus rose from the dead, that death is defeated, that resurrection is real, was first entrusted to a woman whose testimony would be dismissed in her culture, whose word would not be accepted in court, whose gender made her the least likely choice if credibility had been the primary concern. Yet God chose her anyway, or perhaps precisely because she was unlikely, to demonstrate that divine purposes subvert human expectations, that the kingdom of God operates by different principles than earthly kingdoms, that the last shall be first, and the unlikely shall be honoured. Mary's witness teaches that God uses whom he wills regardless of human qualifications, that the message matters more than the messenger's social status, and that faithfulness is what God honours even when culture dismisses. These themes converge to make Mary Magdalene's story a testimony that has spoken to believers across centuries and cultures. Every person who feels too broken for grace can look to Mary and know that 7 demons did not disqualify her from becoming a devoted disciple. Every believer who struggles to remain faithful through difficult circumstances can look to Mary's persistence at the cross and at the tomb and find encouragement to endure. Every person who feels marginalised or dismissed by society can look to Mary's commissioning as first witness and know that God honours those whom the world overlooks, that his choice falls on the unlikely, that his purposes are accomplished through those who are faithful regardless of whether they are considered credible. Modern archaeological discoveries have added texture to Mary's story, even while leaving many questions unanswered. Excavations at Magdala since 2009 have uncovered a first-century synagogue, ritual baths, a marketplace, and evidence of the fishing industry that made the town prosperous. These discoveries confirm that Magdala was indeed a significant town in Jesus' time, lending historical plausibility to the gospel accounts that a woman from this place might have had means to support Jesus' ministry. They help us visualize the world Mary came from, the culture she left behind to follow an itinerant rabbi, the prosperity she walked away from to embrace the uncertainty of discipleship. The fragments of Mary's story preserved in the Gospels may seem sparse compared to the detailed narratives we have of some other biblical figures. But what is preserved is precious and sufficient. We know enough to understand that she was radically transformed, completely devoted, persistently faithful, and uniquely honoured as the first witness of resurrection. We know that her testimony was initially dismissed but ultimately vindicated. We know that she was commissioned directly by the risen Christ to proclaim his resurrection to the apostles, and we know that her faithfulness in darkness positioned her for revelation in light. Her life invites every generation to encounter the risen Christ personally. She did not believe second-hand reports or accept testimony from others. She saw him herself, heard him call her name, spoke with him directly, received her commission from his own lips. This personal encounter with the risen Lord, not mediated through others, not dependent on their testimony, not filtered through institutional structures, stands at the foundation of Christian faith. The Church's testimony begins with individuals who saw and heard and touched, who encountered the risen Christ in ways that transformed them from doubters to witnesses, from fearful to bold, from grief-stricken to joy-filled. Mary was first among these witnesses, first to see, first to hear her name spoken by the risen Lord, first to proclaim, "I have seen the Lord." Her voice still echoes across centuries with that declaration. Every Easter morning, when Christians gather to celebrate resurrection, when the gospel is proclaimed and Christ is declared risen, Mary Magdalene's testimony sounds through the liturgy and the preaching and the joy. The woman who came to the tomb in darkness and left in light, who sought a corpse and found a living Lord, who went to mourn and was sent to proclaim, her story is the story of resurrection itself, of death transformed into life, of grief becoming joy, of endings becoming beginnings. From the empty tomb, her voice still calls every believer to personal encounter with the risen Christ, to devotion that persists through darkness, to faithfulness that does not calculate cost, to witness that proclaims regardless of reception. The first witness of resurrection continues to testify, not through her physical voice which fell silent centuries ago, but through the story preserved in the Gospels, through the legacy honoured in Christian tradition, through the model she provides of transformation and devotion and faithfulness. Mary Magdalene, delivered from 7 demons, devoted disciple, faithful at the cross, first at the tomb, first to see the risen Lord, first to proclaim his resurrection, apostle to the apostles, witness whose testimony changed the world. Her story began in darkness and bondage, moved through devotion and loss, and culminated in light and revelation. And through her story, the truth she proclaimed on that first day of the week continues to resound. I have seen the Lord. Death is defeated, the tomb is empty, Christ is risen. And the voice that called her by name in the garden still calls every human heart to encounter the risen Christ, and, having encountered him, to go and tell what they have seen and heard. The legacy of the first witness endures not in speculation about her later years, or in legends that cannot be verified, but in the testimony preserved in the Gospels, in the role she played at the pivot point of human history, in the faithfulness she modelled, in the grace she received, in the commission she fulfilled. From Magdala to the garden tomb, From demon possession to resurrection proclamation, from darkness to light, from death to life, this is her journey, and through her journey the gospel itself is proclaimed. That no one is too broken for grace, that devotion is honoured with revelation, and that the risen Christ still calls his own by name and sends them forth to testify to what they have seen and heard. "I have seen the Lord," Mary announced on that first day. And in every generation since, that announcement continues to be the foundation of Christian faith, the testimony that transforms lives, the proclamation that echoes from that empty tomb to every corner of the world where the gospel is preached and the risen Christ is known.